What does it take for someone to be compliant with a new dietary intervention? And I even hate to use the word diet because what we really want to know is what does it take for someone to be compliant with a whole new lifestyle long term? You know, a 6-week diet, a 10-week diet, all right, that might have short-term implications, but what really matters is long-term compliance. And let's be honest, you know, the literature is pretty clear that behavior change on average is hard. It's difficult for the majority of people. Some people are going to do fantastic and some people are going to struggle. But what are the keys, the key features and the key components that help people with long-term compliance? I'm Dr. Brett Scher, the medical director at dietdoctor.com. As good timing has it, there are actually 3 studies that came out pretty recently that I think really bring this concept of adherence together. So I want to go through these 3 studies with you because they each have different specifics and then talk about the key messages to see what your take home can be about maybe how this can help you with your longer term compliance with new healthy lifestyle. So let's talk about the first one. This was in the Journal of Diabetology. It was a 12-week study in India. And this was a real-world study, not randomized, but a real-world intervention study, which I like because it was very culturally appropriate. As you may have heard in my podcast with Dr. Sangani from India, there's a big problem with the bread products. And even just reducing some of the bread and the whole grain products made significant differences in her patients. Well, what this study does was something similar. They wanted to replace the usual high-carb, high-grain-based flour with a seed-based flour that's lower overall net carbohydrates. So they provided this flour to all the participants. And all these participants were obese with type 2 diabetes. They also provided recipes and some individual counseling and an ongoing coaching interaction. So it was a relatively high-touch program with good follow-up and good engagement. What they found was after only 12 weeks, keep in mind, only 12 weeks, the hemoglobin A1C dropped from 8.6% to 6.3%. So that's a 2.3 drop, which is pretty impressive in 12 weeks. And their mean weight loss was 9 kilograms or almost 20 pounds. And the triglycerides and LFTs also improved. So in only 12 weeks, with the main intervention being providing the seed-based flour instead of the grain-based flour, and then having the coaching interaction and the recipes. So pretty impressive study, and again, culturally relevant because it was meant to address the biggest problem within the Indian culture, which is the grain-based flours. Now, let's compare that to another one published in the Canadian Journal of Rural Medicine. And what this one does, it was called the Not Fed trial, kind of a funny name. But this was a very low resource trial. It was in a rural area. And, you know, in the paper, they acknowledge in rural areas, access to healthcare and nutritional advice is limited. It tends to be lower socioeconomic status. So resources aren't abundant. This was in a town of 5,000 people in Canada, and what they did was they just gave some general advice to eat in a 16-8 pattern and some general advice on how to lower carbohydrates, whether they ate Mediterranean, paleo, keto, it didn't matter. They didn't prescribe that. They just gave some general advice on lowering carbohydrates. There was really not much more intervention, and they made a big point to say there was no increase in staffing hours. So it didn't take any extra time from anybody who was, already doing their job because they didn't have the resources in this type of small town, rural town. They didn't have the resources. Now, what's interesting is there was a 62% dropout rate over the course of a year, which sounds really high. In honesty, for a lot of studies show similar dropout rates over the course of a year. So only 38% stayed in it. But those who did, they lost 8 kilograms or 9% of their body weight. And their self-reported health improved significantly. So they felt much better. So this was really interesting because it shows how a minimal approach, a very low resource-based approach, can help a small percentage of the population quite dramatically. That there definitely are some people who don't need much more support. But the dropout rate of 62% makes me want to say what else could have been done. Now, without using much resources, it would have been tough. But it would have been very interesting to see if they paired with someone like Diet Doctor or someone who has the recipes, the resources, the meal plans, the shopping list, an easy support-based app or platform to help them, how that would have increased their adherence. So I'd love to see that. But then the third study, done by Dr. Gardner and Lucia Aronica from Stanford, and we've had a podcast with Dr. Aronica before. This study was a little more hands-on, a more intensive study. And what this was a randomized crossover trial where they did 4 weeks of a very low-carb ketogenic diet or a Mediterranean diet where all the food was provided, and then 12 weeks where they did self-providing of the food. They made their own foods rather than having them provided and delivered. Now, this did happen sort of right as COVID was hitting, so some of the protocols got messed up a little bit, but that was the intention of the study. So basically, both diets, whether you're keto or Mediterranean, were to limit refined grains and sugars. And then, of course, the keto also avoided most fruits, whole grains, and legumes, whereas the Mediterranean allowed those. And in the end, the keto diet was 10% carbs, 25% protein, 63% fat, whereas the Mediterranean was 34% carbs, 19% protein, 45% fat. And as we've seen with some of Professor Gardner's studies, basically both diets are dramatic improvements from the baseline diet and the standard American diet, because they both are limiting refined grains and sugars. They're both dramatically improving sort of the whole food component of the diets. So both diets are a dramatic improvement from baseline. Now they're going to report the blood glucose and weight and all that separately. This was just an adherence score. And they didn't give percentages. Instead, they gave on a 10 scale, what's the adherence. So while the food was being provided, both the keto diet and the Mediterranean diet had adherence scores of about 7.5. And then when they were doing the diet on their own, both diets had an adherence score of about 5.5, so went down, but still roughly equivalent. They had to come up with their own adherence score, which is kind of interesting because eating fibrous veggies was part of the adherence score to both diets. So if you were on a more meat-based keto diet, interestingly, you might have gotten a lower adherence score. That's sort of how I interpret what they reported there. But that's sort of an interesting aside. Basically, the conclusion was there wasn't much of a difference in terms of adherence, and this was an intervention that had quite a bit of support, quite a bit of follow-up. And they concluded that the characteristics that they interpreted as being most important for adherence are, one, providing the food, because the adherence was very good when the food was provided. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Being closely monitored. That also makes a lot of sense. Knowing someone's watching you and paying attention to you gives you that sort of accountability that you're going to pay more attention. Measuring your own adherence. So they used a CGM and ketone monitors, and they found adherence improved when people were using those devices. So that's important. And giving personalized goals and to help with adherence. So I think that the take-home message from all these trials is, yes, dietary adherence, lifestyle adherence can be difficult, but there are characteristics that make it much easier. And one is being culturally relevant, and that's what I really like about that study in India. Two is self-selection, letting people sort of self-select what they feel best at as long as they're hitting their goals. And that's what sort of that rural one in Canada showed me, that for those 36% or 38% who stuck with the diet, they had significant improvement because they found the program that worked for them. They found the dietary pattern that worked for them. And then with Dr. Gardner's study, having close follow-up, having close intervention, having accountability measurements like CGMs or ketone meters, personalized goals and adherence, and of course, providing food all help. So what can we make of all this? Well, at Diet Doctor, this is part of our mission, right? To find out what's going to help people with long-term healthy weight loss, metabolic health, feeling better, improving their health. That's why we have our personalized meal planner. That's why we have over 1,000 recipes to help you, plus all the video and the content to help inform you. So, if you can find a way that works for you and we can support you, that's what we want to do. If you're doing research on behavioral changes in different programs, look, we would love to be involved. Reach out to me and let me know, because if we can provide some support to test this and help people, I think that would be really amazing to help further this field of adherence. Hopefully this was helpful. You can go to dietdoctor.com to see all our resources that can help you with your lifestyle changes. In the meantime, hit the thumbs up and the subscribe down below if this was helpful, so you get all our updates here on Diet Doctor News on YouTube. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great day.